Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. It appears that Mike Henderson, the interstate stalker, had been operating 18-wheelers for more than 15 years when he came across something that would follow him for the rest of his life. On a chilly February evening in 2018, Mike was traveling along Interstate 25 from Phoenix to Denver with a load of electronics. He was accustomed to the loneliness, the long miles of pitch-black roadway, and the peculiar cast of personalities that appeared after midnight because he was a seasoned night driver. However, he was unprepared for what transpired during those frightful hours between 2 a.m. and sunrise. Just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, the trouble began. A battered white vehicle was parked in the shadows close to the edge of the lot when Mike stopped into a truck stop to get coffee and look at his logbook. The car itself wasn't out of the ordinary. Across America, truck stops were dotted with several broken down cars. His gaze was drawn to the lifeless man sitting behind the wheel, looking straight at him through the glass. It looked like a middle-aged man with hollow cheeks and stringy hair. Mike could sense the intensity of that stare even from 50 yards away. His skin crawled. In an attempt to dispel the sensation, he hurriedly completed his tasks and got back into his taxi. He looked in his mirrors as he left the truck stop and turned back onto I-25 heading north. He was being followed by a white automobile. Mike initially convinced himself that it was merely a coincidence. Perhaps the man was also going north. However, the sedan consistently stayed roughly a quarter of a mile behind his trailer. As the miles passed, the automobile sped up when Mike did. It also slowed down when he did. The vehicle changed lanes when he did. The headlights in his reflection seemed to loom large and ominous all the time. Approximately 3 a.m, Mike made the decision to investigate his suspicions. He circled around the deserted streets of Santa Rosa, a small town, before returning to the freeway. His precise path was followed by the white sedan, which never drew nearer or retreated. Mike's hands on the steering wheel started to perspire. This was no accident. He was being purposefully stalked. There was tremendous psychological pressure. Those headlights were there every time Mike looked in his mirrors, staring at him like eyes in the dark. He attempted to use his CV radio to phone other truckers, but few drivers were awake and talkative due to the late hour. The loneliness was debilitating. The pursuit went on with mechanical precision, mile after mile, hour after hour. The driver's actions made it even more horrifying. Typical stalkers may attempt to pass, make menacing gestures, or make contact of some sort. None of stuff was done by this individual. With the patience of a predator, they merely followed, keeping that precise distance, never faltering, never revealing their intentions. There was uncertainty, frustrating. The possibilities rushed through Mike's head. Was this a truck driver targeting serial killer? Had he heard tales of highway murderers who preyed on lonesome motorists? Was he going to be robbed at a gas station? Or was it worse than that? Perhaps the start of a complex trap including several cars. By 4 a.m, Mike was struggling with panic. His coffee was chilly. Static crackled on his radio, unlike luminous eyeballs. Those headlights stayed glued to his mirrors. He thought of phoning 911, but what would he say to them? That he was on a public roadway with someone driving behind him. Instead of dealing with paranoid drivers frightened by traffic, police dealt with actual crimes. Then something was different. The vehicle started to get closer as they got closer to the Colorado border. It approached Mike's trailer slowly and deliberately. A 4-mile change to 500, then 300, then 200 yards. Mike felt his heart pounding in his chest. Why was the stalker now approaching after hours of keeping a perfect distance? When Mike noticed a rest area up ahead, he knew the answer. He saw the white automobile take the off-ramp and vanish into the night in his mirror as he passed the exit. Mike felt a surge of physical relief wash over him. The nightmare was finished. It wasn't over, though. Mike was jogging the same trip from Phoenix to Denver 3 weeks later. The same section of I-25, but with a different load and night, around 2:30 a.m. In his mirrors he saw a familiar scene just south of Albuquerque. The same exact quarter-mile distance was being maintained by a white vehicle. The same deliberate stalking behavior, hollow-faced driver. Mike was prepared. Now, he had 911 on speed dial and his phone charged. Once more, though, the car followed 4 hours without posing any threat, vanished at the Colorado border, and Mike began to doubt his own sanity. What kind of person followed random truck drivers all night long? What was the purpose? A month later, the third confrontation took place. Same white vehicle, same time, same route. Mike had done his homework by now. He had posted on trucking forums, gotten in touch with other drivers, and even called state police. He was completely chilled by what he found. There were other victims, besides Mike. In 2017 and 2018, at least 7 other truck drivers claimed to have been followed by through New Mexico or a white automobile on I-25, the same section of highway every time, invariably between 2 a.m. and 6 in the morning. Constantly the same pattern of conduct, meticulous following, flawless distance keeping, and disappearance at the Colorado border. However, there was more. Following their interactions, two drivers said they had learned their personal information. Someone had done the investigation and collated the names of family members, home addresses, and work schedules. Evidence of someone spying his house was discovered by one driver. His wife had been followed to work. Another found out. The ramifications were horrifying. This wasn't just any harassment on the highway. The highway was being used by someone to find and investigate possible victims. Following the patient 4 hours was more than just mental anguish. They were reconnaissance. The stalker was picking up habits, routines, and routes, constructing records on lone drivers who followed recognizable routes throughout desolate terrain. The identity of the driver of the white vehicle remained unknown to Mike. The stalker was never apprehended, even after being reported to several law enforcement authorities. In late 2018, the encounters ceased as strangely as they had started. Perhaps the individual went to a new hunting area. In another state, they might have escalated to more serious offenses, or perhaps they are still searching for their next victim while driving down shadowy routes. Mike was irrevocably altered by the encounter. He put in several dashes. Never takes the same path twice, always has pepper spray on hand, and has cameras. He keeps a constant distance behind him and continuously checks his mirrors, feeling his heart race anytime he sees headlights. What happened to Mike isn't the most terrifying aspect. It's what could have occurred to drivers who weren't as cautious, fortunate, or ready. Predators have countless opportunities to prey amid the wide emptiness of the American highway system, where cell coverage is sporadic and assistance can be hours away. Each and every thousands of truck drivers drive alone through the night on dark interstates, leaving them open to attack by anyone who is twisted enough to exploit the transportation system as their own hunting field. Real monsters aren't supernatural, as Mike's story serves as a reminder. They are people. They have patience. They are currently waiting in the shadows between cities, anticipating their next chance to transform a person's everyday drive into a nightmare that will follow them for the rest of their lives, to a frequency that must never be discovered. After 12 years of hauling freight throughout the Midwest, Tommy Rodriguez found the frequency that made all the difference. In January 2019, a severe snowfall closed majority of Interstate 70 during an especially harsh winter drive from Chicago to Kansas City. One of the few insane drivers who continued to roll through the whiteout conditions was Tommy. Other truckers were warning him over his CB radio about impassable roads and jackknife semis up ahead. Approximately 3 in the morning, in a remote area of Missouri, Tommy's CB began to behave strangely. There was an unsettling calm that appeared to press against his eardrums as the normal noise from other drivers turned to static. In an attempt to find a clear channel, he tinkled with the dial until he came across something that chilled him to the bone. Initially, the sound was reminiscent of children singing, a gentle, eerie tune that seemed to float over the static like voices from another planet. Tommy, however, became increasingly aware that it wasn't singing as he listened more intently. It was in tears, children's voices, all crying in perfect harmony. Tommy had to stop and see whether there were genuine children in his taxi, since the sound was so terrible and lifelike. The sobbing lasted precisely 3 minutes before coming to an abrupt halt. Silence was worse than what came next. The sound was that of breathing. Despite Tommy's heater being on full blast, his slow, deliberate breaths seemed to fog up his windshield from the inside. A visible cloud of condensation formed with each exhale, spelling words. The words "help us" flashed on the passenger side window before disappearing. To record what was happening, Tommy reached for his phone, but it was dead. Nor low battery, as though something had immediately depleted all of its power. His cab's temperature plummeted so quickly that he could see his own breath blending with the enigmatic condensation on the windows, and his dashboard electronics started to flicker. The radio's breathing sounds became more intense and louder. Tommy heard what sounded like scratching coming from inside his speakers, like fingernails tearing at them. The whispers followed. A terrible chorus of pleas was produced by dozens of little voices speaking simultaneously. "Don't abandon us. It's freezing. We are unable to locate our home. Kindly, sir, please assist us." Tommy was so frantic to change the frequency and stop the radio that his hands trembled as he went for the dial. However, the voices followed him regardless of the channel he chose. Somehow, they were ingrained in his radio system, becoming more powerful and distinct every minute. The kids talked of becoming lost in the snow and being stuck in a place that was constantly winter, dark, and cold. A young girl who couldn't have been older than 7 years old started talking to Tommy directly. She was aware of his name, that he drove a truck, and on the highway, he was by himself. She told him about the others, the scores of kids who had been lost in blizzards over the years, whose bodies had never been located, and who were still stranded in a never-ending winter without any aid. In Tommy's cab, the temperature kept decreasing. On the inside of his windows, ice started to build, producing complex designs that uncannily resembled small handprints. He exhaled invisible puffs that hung in the air longer than they should have, producing little face-like figures before vanishing. The young girl's voice then became frantic and frightened. There was more in the static between them, she said. Tommy, something that pursued the missing kids. Something that fueled their panic and anxiety. Before the radio noticed him, she pleaded with him to switch it off. Before it became aware that someone was actually listening to their frequency, Tommy, however, was immobile. He was drawn more into their frozen world by the mesmerizing whispers. Through his frosted windshield, he could practically see them. Tiny people trudging amid unending mounds of snow. The cold blasted from their lips. A terrible sense of despondency was reflected in their eyes. With fingertips that resembled icicles, they groped for his truck, begging for warmth, for help, for someone to notice them. The radio began to scratch violently, as though something with claws was attempting to rip itself from the speakers. The children's cries turned into terrified screams. alerting Tommy to the fact that the hunter had located them and was pursuing him as well. In spiderweb patterns, the ice on his windows started to shatter. Tommy could swear he saw bright eyes observing him from the storm outside through the fissures. The engine of his pickup died out of the blue. The lights all went out. The wind roaring and the frightened wailing of phantom children were the only sounds. Tommy felt the temperature drop even further in the complete darkness of his taxi. His cheeks, toes, and fingertips all became numb. He was stuck in an unimaginable cold that existed between radio frequencies, freezing to death in his own truck. The little girl's voice, no more than a whisper, broke through the confusion one last time. "Don't allow it to get to you. Switch off the radio. Save yourself." Using the final, Tommy grabbed the CB radio with all of his strength and tore the power line out of its socket. Everything ceased when the link was lost. The temperature returned to normal quickly. He roared back to life with his engine. His dispatcher asked him why he hadn't checked in. His phone flashed on, displaying scores of missed calls. Tommy didn't stop and continued driving all the way to Kansas City. However, the encounter had fundamentally altered him. The sound of those kids' voices kept coming back to him. He was unable to forget the sensation of unnatural cold that had almost killed him. Worse, he started looking into cases of missing children along his regular travels and found a disturbing trend. In the Midwest, winter storms have claimed the lives of over 30 children in the last 50 years. Their remains were never found. Eventually, their cases were closed, leaving their families with nothing but sorrow and unanswered questions. The disappearances invariably occurred during the greatest blizzards, when rescue attempts were difficult and visibility was at nil. In order to study the faces of missing children whose cases went back decades, Tommy began keeping copies of missing person flyers in his taxi. His CB radio would occasionally crackle with static, and he would hear the echoes of familiar voices on deserted highways late at night. The same kids who had talked to him that frightful Missouri night. Never again did he tune to that frequency. He didn't have to, though. Even so, the voices reached him, whispering through his radio in the deadliest hours of the night, reminding him that scores of lost souls were still calling for aid that would never arrive somewhere in the static between stations, stuck in an endless winter. Even though Tommy stopped working long-distance trucking 6 months later, he still gets up in the middle of the night occasionally, hears kids sobbing, and feels ice crystals accumulating on the windows of his bedroom. He's aware that the frequency is still in use, just waiting for a winter storm to happen and the next lonesome motorist to discover it. And he is aware that those lost kids may eventually manage to entice someone else into their icy realm, where the cold never goes away and the snow never stops falling. 3. The non-existent mile marker. Danny Walsh believed he knew every inch of the Interstate 80 between Sacramento and Reno. For 8 years, he had been transporting vegetables from the Central Valley of California to the casinos and dining establishments in Nevada twice a week. He knew the freeway as well as his own driveway. Every bend, slope, every mile sign that separates the desert from the Pacific shore. He was therefore deeply shaken by what transpired on a misty October night in 2020. Around 2 in the morning, it began, when Danny was ascending the mountains of the Sierra Nevada. There was only around 20 feet of vision in front of his headlights due to a dense fog that had swept in. It was the type of soup that caused seasoned drivers to slow down to a crawl and hope they didn't hit someone who had stopped in the street. At around 25, Danny was creeping along with his hazard lights blazing when he noticed the mile marker, mile 187. The issue was that this section of I-80 did not have mile 187. Danny was well versed in the system of numbers. Just before the Cisco Grove exit was mile 186, and mile 188 was close to the turnoff for Soda Springs. Mile 187 did not exist. Mile 187 had never existed, but there it was, standing precisely where it shouldn't have been, shining white in his headlights. Squinting through the fog to make sure he wasn't seeing things, Danny slowed down even further. The sign has the same appearance as all the other freeway mile markers. The same green backdrop had the same reflective finish and white letters, but it signified a mile that was unreal. Something changed when Danny crossed the impossible marker. Around his truck, the fog appeared to get thicker until his headlights could hardly see 5 feet in front of them. It sounded muffled and far away, as though he were driving underwater. The usual sounds of the highway, the rumble of his diesel engine, and the thud of his tires on asphalt. Then he caught sight of the hitchhiker. A person with a thumb outstretched stood on the shoulder, utterly still in the whirling mist. As he went by, Denny's beam swept across the individual, but there was no way to discern any details due to the fog. A hazy human form that appeared to absorb light instead of reflect it. Danny had seen many hitchhikers in her 8 years of night driving, but none who waited by the side of the road, so motionless as a statue. He observed another one a quarter of a mile later. The same position, the same strange silence, the same ability to absorb light. Then one more and one more. Before long, Danny was passing hitchhikers every few hundred yards. They were all the same in their still position and equally undetectable, save for their simple human figures. The fog started to manipulate perspective and distance. After reaching the impossibly high mile 187, Danny felt as though he had been driving 4 hours, but his odometer indicated that he had just traveled 3 miles. The road appeared to go on forever. With every turn, more fog, more hitchhikers, and more unreal geography he revealed. His CB radio died after crackling with static. Even his truck's integrated navigation system was perplexed, flashing question marks where the highway number should have been, and his GPS displayed a blank screen with the statement, "Location not found." It appeared as though he had driven into an area that lay between the official mile markers, off the border of the known globe. The hitchhikers started to evolve. As Danny passed, they began to turn their heads to follow his truck, rather than remain still. Through the fog, he was unable to see their faces, but he could sense their focus on him, his fingers against his back. As his headlights drew closer, a few of them moved toward the road, perhaps debating whether to walk straight into his path. Danny attempted to radio for assistance, alternating between emergency and CB frequencies, but each channel yielded the same outcome. Only sporadic bursts of static, which sounded unsettlingly like muttered whispers, broke the dead silence. The tone was definitely urgent, as though dozens of people were attempting to warn him of something horrible coming, but the words were too garbled to make sense. Mile 187, 5 showed up in his headlights. Next, mile 187, 7. Next, mile 187, 9. With increasing fear, Danny recognized that he was stuck in a single mile of highway that had somehow been extended into an interminable loop. It seemed as though distance itself had become odd and stretchy. As the mile signs were ticking up in fractions, they were becoming more daring hitchhikers. Danny had to swerve past several of them because they were now standing right on the middle line. Despite the speed of his truck, others strolled beside it, keeping up, their footsteps in some way. Over the sound of the engine, as Danny glanced in his mirrors, he saw them trailing behind his trailer, an increasing line of dark shapes that appeared in the fog and then vanished again. Mile 187, 9. Hundreds of them were present. They faced ease. Truckmen were completely silent as they lined both sides of the roadway like paragoers. Danny could hardly see the road surface due to the dense fog, so he had to go by the reflective lane markers appeared to radiate light from within. Then he spotted mile 100, the actual mile 888, which was precisely where every map and GPS device in the world indicated it should be. Just like a curtain being drawn back, the fog abruptly lifted as Denny's headlights struck the well-known marking. In an instant, the hitchhikers disappeared, leaving no evidence of their presence. His radio came back to life with the usual buzz of the roadway. When his GPS returned, it displayed his precise location on I-80 between Cisco Grove and Soda Springs. After pulling into the next truck stop, Danny checked his watch, odometer, and logbooks for 20 minutes. Every instrument in his truck indicated that he had traveled precisely 1 mile between markers 187 and 188. At a slower speed, the drive had lasted exactly 2 minutes and 37 seconds, which is standard time for that section of roadway. However, Danny was aware that he had encountered an impossibility. For what seemed like hours, he had been stuck in a mile of road that was officially didn't exist, encircled by people who shouldn't be there. It felt unnatural to drive through such dense fog. When he went home, he looked into the area, searching for any historical oddities, accidents, or disappearances that would explain what he had experienced. More than the event itself, what he discovered chilled him. In the previous 3 decades, 7 drivers have shared comparable experiences on that particular section of I-80. Every time, it was in dense fog, with improbable mile markers and enigmatic hitchhikers, and it lasted precisely 1 mile before heading back to the regular route. 3 of the drivers were completely gone. Their trucks were discovered with their engines still running at rest areas or truck stops. According to logbooks, they had just stopped in the middle of their journey for no apparent reason. The drivers were never seen once again, as though they had left their lives behind and disappeared into the mists. Danny continues to drive I-80, but when the weather forecast predicts fog in the mountains, he takes a different route. Late at night, he has overheard other truckers discussing mile 187 on the CB radio. There have been tales of vehicles becoming lost between the markers, picking up non-human hitchhikers, and finding themselves stuck on the same mile again and over again until they either escaped or joined whatever was haunting that unreachable section of the highway. On nights when the stars are clear, are bright, and the road is deserted, but Danny believes he can still make out them in the distance. There are figures on the side of the road with their thumbs out, anxiously waiting for the next motorist to become disoriented in the fog and find the mile marker that appears just when you need it most, but isn't marked on any official map. 4. The rest stop that feeds at night. During his 15-year career, Jake Morrison had hauled freight across the nation, pulling into thousands of truck stops, but he had never seen one like Sunset Ridge Travel Plaza. He saw it in his headlights at about 3 in the morning. A vast network of gas pumps, parking lots, and a main building that appeared much too big for such a barren section of Interstate 80 on a moonless night in rural Nebraska. Jake was initially taken aback by how flawless everything appeared. The majority of truck stops displayed their age, weeds sprouting through the asphalt, neon signs that flicker, and cracked pavement. Sunset Ridge, however, seems to have been constructed just yesterday. The parking area was immaculate. The facade of the structure was illuminated by strategically placed floodlights. Even the fuel pumps, with their throwback 1980s style, looked brand new. Jake parked his trailer into an empty parking spot next to the building so he could get some gasoline and take a restroom break. Then he saw something strange. There were no other cars in sight, even though the truck stop was spotless and well lit. Under those 2 blazing lights, there was nothing but empty space extending in all directions. No trucks, no automobiles, no motorcyclists. As Jake got closer, the glass doors of the main structure opened automatically, setting out a happy electronic chime. His complexion appeared pale and sickly as fluorescent lights pulsed overhead, illuminating everything in a harsh white glow. It was a standard arrangement: gaming, a hot meal counter, and rows of snacks and beverages machines, and a tiny space with chairs and tables made of plastic. However, There was a problem with the product. As he scanned the shelves in the snack aisle, Jake saw that, although everything appeared regular from a distance, the details were all incorrect. Although the candy bar's brand names were well known, the typography was a little strange. Kit Kat, with 2 T's and Sneakers in place of Snickers. The logos on the soda cans were nearly identical to those of Pepsi and Coca-Cola, but not silent. A clerk at the counter grinned too broadly when Jake walked up to him, despite the late hour. The man's uniform appeared pressed and starched, and his grey hair was neatly combed, giving the impression that he was in his 50s. His eyes were all dark, yet his name tag said Harold in friendly letters. The whole viewable area, not just the pupils, as if peering into 2 shadowy wells. Harold said, "Welcome to Sunset Ridge," in a voice that seemed to be emanating from a very deep hole. "This evening, what can I get you?" Harold's incredibly broad smile faltered as he gestured toward a hallway at the rear of the store. "The restrooms are down the hall, past the arcade." "Coffee's fresh, made just for you," Jake muttered, adding that he needed to use the restroom and buy some coffee. The hallway was longer than it should have been, extending back far beyond what the building's exterior dimensions would permit. As Jake passed the old, cheaply framed pictures of truck drivers, families, and travelers that lined the walls, he noticed something unsettling about them. Their eyes were wrong, just like Harold's, and they were all black, reflecting the fluorescent lights in the hallway like dark mirrors. Trying to get rid of the eerie feeling that had been hovering over him since entering the building, Jake splashed water on his face and looked in the mirror. He could see the bathroom door behind him in the reflection, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw Harold standing there, watching him. But when he turned around, the doorway was empty. Back in the main store. "Harold, drive safe now," Harold said as Jake made his way out. "And remember, Sunset Ridge is always here when you need us." He was waiting with a steaming cup of coffee, and that same eerie smile, and the coffee smelled amazing, rich and aromatic in a way that made Jake's mouth water. Despite his growing uneasiness, he paid with cash, observing that Harold's fingers were unusually cold when their hands briefly touched during the transaction. Always waiting, always open. 3 hours later, Jake pulled into a legitimate truck stop in Iowa for his required rest break, getting back into his truck and leaving the parking lot, eager to get some distance away from the strange truck stop. However, as he merged back onto the interstate, he discovered that he couldn't remember exactly where the exit had been. He checked his GPS, browsed through the truck stop directory on his phone, and even pulled up satellite maps of the area. But there was no Sunset Ridge Travel Plaza anywhere along this stretch of I-80. The other trucker, an older man named Carl, went pale when he mentioned Sunset Ridge to another driver, describing the too perfect facility, and the odd clerk. "You entered the house. You're fortunate to be alive. Jesus, son," Carl said, his voice hardly audible above a whisper. Carl shared with Jake the rumors that were going around among long-distance drivers. Stories of truck stops that appeared when drivers were tired, desperate, or lost. Places that appeared perfect on the outside, but were something else entirely. Something that fed on travelers who stopped for rest, food, or fuel. Whispered conversations on CB radio in the deadliest hours of the night. And, Carl said, drivers who stayed too long at these phantom truck stops were never seen again. Security cameras at actual truck stops occasionally captured footage of missing drivers walking into facilities that didn't exist, following black-eyed clerks into buildings that were larger inside than outside, and their trucks would be discovered abandoned on isolated highways, fuel tanks empty, logbooks displaying improbable mileage readings. "The coffee," Carl said urgently. Jake's blood froze when he said, "Please tell me you didn't drink the coffee." He had consumed almost the whole cup of coffee throughout his journey to Iowa. He emptied it mindlessly because it was the most delicious coffee he had ever tasted. Hours later, he became aware that he felt odd. "It's strange, but not exactly sick," Apollo felt as though nothingness had taken the place of something that had been scooped out of him. In the weeks that followed, Jake made an effort to resume his regular schedule. However, the experience at Sunset Ridge had altered him in ways he was unable to describe. Food didn't taste well. There was no rest in sleep. He was always hungry, but no matter how much he ate, he was never able to sat the yearning. The worst part was that he had to look for the truck stop on every night run, looking for that ideal parking space, and those two bright lights on the horizon. Drivers started to steer clear of Jake. They claimed that even though he was eating, he somehow seemed off. Despite spending his days in the sun, he was always pallid, and his eyes had taken on an odd appearance that made people uneasy. Jake recognized their terror when he saw his image in the truck stop mirrors. It seemed as though something was gradually eating away at the edges of his eyes, making them darker. Every night the yearning got stronger. In order to find a truck stop that existed somewhere between the official highway maps and the shadowy areas where hungry monsters lurked, Jake would frequently find himself taking detours down unknown roads and following vaguely remembered exit signs referred to as home. Sunset Ridge was calling to him now, so he knew he would locate it when he eventually found it again. Harold would be ready with another cup of exquisite coffee and that big smile. 3 months later, Jake's truck was discovered on a desolate section of the Nebraska highway. Despite being filled only hours before, the fuel tank is inexplicably empty, and the engine is still running. He had traveled 847 miles at night, according to his logbook, but according to his GPS, he had never left the truck stop where he had begun his shift. Security cameras saw Jake entering what looked to be a truck stop, a brightly lit structure. The coffee counter gleamed like a shrine under fluorescent lights, and they followed a man in a pressed uniform. After 60 seconds, the building disappeared from the video, leaving behind Jake's abandoned truck's distant glow and an empty highway. Even so, drivers continue to claim seeing Sunset Ridge on moonless evenings when the highway seems to go on forever. The fuel gauge is empty, and the urge for coffee is too great to ignore. They notice the two bright lights, the ideal parking lot, and Harold standing behind the counter, waiting patiently for the next driver to stop. Harold has black eyes and an impossible smile. Just a little while, just a cup of coffee, just long enough to feed the creature that inhabits the gaps between actual locations and creates truck stops when hungry drivers most need them. 5. The load that whispers back. Over the course of his 20-year trucking career, Rick Martinez has transported everything: furniture, cattle, electronics, and even dangerous commodities that needed specific route and licenses. However, on a chilly March night in 2021, he picked up goods from an unremarkable facility in Detroit that was unlike anything he had ever hauled. It was simply identified on the shipment manifest as medical equipment headed to an Atlanta research institution. The fact that the equipment was still in use was not mentioned. The warehouse was situated in an industrial area that, even in the daytime, appeared deserted. Between deserted houses, strange shadows were formed by broken streetlights, and the only sound was the distant rumble of interstate traffic. Rick backed his trailer up to the loading dock, where a single huge crate and two guys wearing rubber gloves and surgical masks were waiting. Easily 8 feet long, 4 feet broad, and 3 feet deep, the crate was enormous. It was constructed of sturdy steel, had several caution labels emblazoned on it, and reinforced corners. This side up, fragile, only to be transported in a refrigerator, and, most dangerously, never open. Before Rick could raise any questions, the men silently locked it in his trailer, gave him the paperwork, and vanished back into the warehouse. Rick observed that although his trailer was only hauling 1 crate, it felt heavier than normal as he drew away from the loading dock. The weight distribution appeared strange, as though the cargo was changing back there, and his truck strained to accelerate. However, he noticed that the crate was securely fastened with sturdy straps, and had not moved when he looked in his mirrors. About an hour later, the first indication that something was amiss appeared. Into the drive, Rick was traveling south on I-75 when he heard a startling noise coming from his trailer. Like fingernails dragging over metal, there was a faint scratching sound. At the next rest stop, he stopped and went around to inspect his load, but everything appeared to be in order. Straps taut, warning labels still securely affixed. The carton sat just where the warehouse staff had placed it. Rick attempted to tell himself it was simply the usual while he was back in his taxi. Sounds of a lorry becoming used to the beat of the highway. However, the scratching became louder and more persistent as the miles passed. A pattern emerged. After 3 brief scrapes, there is a break, followed by 3 additional scratches. Similar to someone inside the container hammering out a distress signal. Something terrible joined the clawing about midnight. Whispers. Rick initially assumed it was simply the wind blowing through the openings in his trailer doors. However, he was able to discern true words when he switched off his radio and paid attention. A disconcerting chorus of pleas and warnings seemed to come from the steel crate as muffled voices speaking in what seemed like various languages spoke simultaneously. Rick called the number on his shipping manifest as he stopped into a truck stop outside of Cincinnati. The connection was cut off. He made use of the backup contact. One more dead number. He even checked up the address of the Atlanta Research Center online and found it to be a fake. He was transporting an unidentified load for an apparently non-existent corporation to an imaginary location. The trailer's voices became louder. Rick could hear them plainly now through the back wall of the cab. He sat in the truck stop parking lot, trying to think of what to do. Dozens many people using urgent, terrified voices. Some spoke English, describing an endless darkness, begging for assistance, and requesting to be released. There were others who spoke languages Rick didn't recognize, but there was a unifying anguish in their voices. A young woman with a southern accent that made Rick think of his own daughter broke through the confusion with a single voice. "Please open the crate," she pleaded. She had spent so much time indoors that she had forgotten what sunlight looked like. She recounted being abducted from a hospital, being informed that she was a participant in a medical study, and waking up in total darkness with other people who had been duped in a similar way. Rick pondered his options, his hands shaking. He felt compelled to call the police. What would he tell them, though? That he could hear voices coming from inside a locked medical container. That his cargo was speaking to him. They would believe he was either having a breakdown or experiencing hallucinations as a result of too many hours spent driving. The voices grew increasingly forceful as the night went on. Rick was informed about the other people that attempted to take them. Drivers who eventually opened the crate after going crazy listening to the incessant cry for assistance discovered something much worse than they had anticipated. The voices informed him of the research center, detailed unethical tests, and described methods that left people conscious but unable to move or scream. Rick's heater was operating at full capacity, yet the temperature inside his cab started to decrease. His windows developed patterns of frost that resembled unsettling handprints on glass. It seemed as though whatever was keeping them from the outside world was eroding as the voices became more vivid and clear. Individual stories were now audible to Rick. One of the construction workers had been involved in an accident. A lady without a house who had accepted what she believed to be free medical attention. A college student who had offered to participate in what appeared to be a standard study. By daybreak, Rick was at his breaking point. All night long, the voices had been speaking to him, identifying themselves, sharing their tales, and pleading with him to release them from whatever nightmare they had been imprisoned in. Determined to find out what was actually inside the crate, he pulled into an abandoned truck stop and used a crowbar to walk back to his trailer. The heavy-duty lock was easily removed using Rick's crowbar. The voices ceased abruptly as the steel lid groaned open. The only sound in the trailer was Rick's own frightened breathing. and then there was total quiet. A thick coating of dry ice formed within the crate, obscuring his eyesight with clouds of mist. Rick noticed what appeared to be medical equipment. When the fog lifted, cables, tubes, life support systems, and monitoring equipment. However, the apparatus was linked to something that sent shivers down Rick's spine. Dozens of human figures, suspended in a preservation fluid of some sort. They were unaware that their bodies were linked to technology that kept them alive. Their limbs were arranged as though they had been attempting to claw their way out when the preservation process started. Their eyes were wide, but vacant, and their lips were locked in wordless cries. With shaking hands, Rick secured the crate and slammed it shut as he staggered backward. He could still hear them, though, something else, not the preserved bodies. Something that had been speaking to him with their voices, in order to trick him into opening their prison. Whatever intellect was within that container had been posing as the victims and imitating their cries for assistance. That's when the genuine voices began, unnatural noises that appeared to originate from the gaps between the bodies, claiming to show Rick things that would help him comprehend and make him want to join them in their preserved paradise. They were hungry whispers. Despite its weight, the crate started to sway back and forth, the straps straining against something trying to escape from inside. Talking about voices in his trailer and unlawful medical experiments, Rick drove straight to the closest police station and surrendered himself in. The officers discovered just what the manifest had promised when they opened the package. Transporting real medical equipment to an Atlanta research facility. Surgical equipment, heart monitors, and brain scanners are all accurately recorded and accounted for. However, Rick was aware of what he had heard and seen. In whatever mental hospital he is currently staying in, the voices continue to whisper to him occasionally late at night when he is attempting to fall asleep. They inform him about the other people who are out there being carried in identical cages while they cry out for unanswered help. They tell him that he could have joined them, could have stopped the awful weight of consciousness that comes with being alive and cognizant, and could have found peace in their preserved darkness. Similar occurrences are also being reported by other truckers, shipments that beg for liberation, loads that murmur that appear to possess their own mind. The majority of drivers learn to ignore the noises coming from their trailers and turn up their radios. However, some people are unable to ignore the whispers and cannot stop themselves from looking at what they are actually carrying through the night. They find their trucks abandoned on isolated highways. Except for typical cargo and the lingering odor of preservative chemicals, trailers are empty. The voices continue to reverberate, traversing the roads in unlabeled containers, beckoning to drivers who are sufficiently solitary, exhausted, or interested to pay attention. They guarantee answers to queries you were unaware you had. Provide glimmers of a world outside the realm of everyday human existence. Simply open the package to see what's actually inside. You just need to pay attention as the cargo begins to responding whispers. 6. The mirrors that show too much. During his November 2019 voyage from Portland to Phoenix, Bobby Fletcher, who had been fixing truck mirrors for 18 years, had never come across anything such. At a dubious truck repair shop south of Bakersfield, it began with a straightforward side mirror replacement. The kind of store that didn't ask too many questions about how you paid for them or where you obtained your parts, and that remained open all night. Bobby was anxious on busy highways since the previous mirror had been bouncing free for weeks, causing blind spots. Despite the late hour, he drove in when he saw midnight auto repair gleaming under flickering neon signs. He was met by the mechanic, a thin, oily man with yellowed teeth who called himself Pete. He promised to get Bobby back on the road in an hour and gave a reasonable cost for the mirror replacement. In the intense glare of floodlights, Pete worked swiftly to remove Bobby's damaged mirror and install what appeared to be a regular replacement. However, as soon as Bobby got back into his taxi and adjusted the new mirror, He saw that something was off. The reflection was too crisp and clear, revealing details that shouldn't have been visible in the dim parking lot of the repair shop. Bobby observed that the mirror appeared to reflect more than it should when he turned back onto Highway 99. The new mirror showed things that weren't there or shouldn't have been there, while his other mirrors displayed the expected image of his trailer and the road behind him. In shadows where there should be no movement, he saw glimmers of movement, almost human-looking forms that moved in ways that defied physics were seen darting between other cars. Bobby initially persuaded himself that it was only the trickery of his weary eyes. Bobby had been driving for 14 hours straight, on long haul. Truckers were known to experience hallucinations after excessive driving. However, the images in the mirror became unavoidable as the night went on. Bobby started to see what was going on inside other cars in the mirror. The automobile was moving at perfect speed and staying in its lane. But when he passed a sedan on a dark stretch of highway, the driver was slumped over the steering wheel, blood flowing from a head wound, visible in the mirror. The driver looked healthy, awake, and completely normal when Bobby glanced at the car with his own eyes. He saw a family in an SUV in the mirror a few miles later. Bobby saw them screaming in fear, their jaws agape, their eyes reflecting some horrible horror, rather than the typical scene of parents and kids on a road trip. But if he looked straight at the SUV, he could see through the windows that the family was sleeping soundly, the kids contentedly in their car seats. Bobby was seeing the truth behind the surface in the mirror, which revealed the concealed reality that coexisted with the everyday world. Every car he drove by had horrors, tragedies, or secrets that were hidden from view, but were glaringly obvious in the damned reflection. When Bobby checked his own trailer in the mirror, the worst realization occurred. In the mirror, he saw dozens of pallid individuals clinging to the outside of his truck, though other than his load of appliances and furnishings. Their faces were nearly human, and their limbs were extended, but stretched incorrectly, as though someone had attempted to mold clay into a human shape without knowing the right ratios. Their jaws twitched continuously, as though they were attempting to convey an urgent message, and their eyes were pure black. After stopping at the next rest stop, Bobby strolled around his trailer with trembling hands and a flashlight. Everything appeared to be typical. His usual cargo load was fastened with ties and regulation straps. There were no figures or irregularities. However, the pale figures were still there, still hanging to his vehicle, still trying to communicate with him through their silent words. As he went back to his cab and looked in the mirror, the images in the mirror grew increasingly agitated as the night wore on. They appeared to be alerting Bobby of an impending danger as they hurriedly motioned at other cars, as though they were attempting to get him ready for some horrible incident that only they could see coming. Their movements and wordless cries grew increasingly desperate. Bobby appeared in the mirror. Hints of what lies ahead. He witnessed emergency vehicles with flashing lights, his own truck being jackknifed over several highway lanes, and body bags being loaded into ambulances. The pictures were short, but incredibly detailed. Even the precise location of the sun in the sky, along with identifiable landmarks and mile markers, suggested that these events would take place at dawn. Bobby attempted to cover the mirror with a towel, but the cloth seemed to be translucent, allowing him to see through it. No matter how many times he tried to move the mirror to point away from the road, it kept going back to its previous position. The damned mirror had grown obsessed with revealing to him things he didn't want to see, facts he wasn't supposed to be aware of. When Bobby got closer to the precise spot he'd seen in his future visions, the pale beings became increasingly agitated. They put their faces against what appeared to be an imperceptible wall separating their world from his, pointed ahead, and made frenzied gestures. Bobby could see through the mirror that the highway in front of him was covered in debris, twisted metal, strewn about cargo, and emergency personnel who moved in the unhurried, methodical manner of those handling large numbers of victims. However, everything seemed normal When Bobby glanced at the same section of road through his windshield, traffic moved well in the early morning. There were no indications of a collision, and the pavement was clear. He was seeing a future tragedy in the mirror, one that had not yet occurred, but was nonetheless unavoidably coming. Bobby's CB only generated static when he attempted to radio other truckers to alert them of possible dangers up ahead. He tried dialing 911 to report possibly an accident, but even though he was in an area with typically good coverage, his phone indicated no signal. More furiously, the ghostly images in the mirror pointed at his driving wheel as if to compel him to do something. Bobby became aware of the terrible reality as morning drew near. He was seeing more than simply the future in the mirror. It was demonstrating his part in its creation. The mishap he witnessed would result from the choices he made over the course of the following few minutes. He wasn't being warned about someone else's tragedy by the pale figures. They were attempting to keep him from becoming the reason behind it. As other cars drove past, Bobby parked his pickup on the shoulder and sat there. Their drivers were not aware of the impending disaster. He could see the pallid forms in the mirror nodding in agreement, their frenetic movements relaxing to soft words of encouragement. Bobby had somehow altered the destiny the mirror had depicted for him by refusing to move on and play his part in the predestined disaster. But he was not the only victim of the mirror's curse. The reflection started to show Bobby different futures, other catastrophes he might cause or stop. While he sat on the highway shoulder, he imagined that he would be driving through a school zone, just as kids would be crossing the roadway. He witnessed the brake on his truck fail, setting off a series of events that would result in the deaths of dozens of people. He witnessed every calamity that might arise from his continuous presence on the highway. That morning, after 18 years of truck driving, Bobby left his vehicle and never looked back. 3 days later, the highway patrol located the car. The driver is nowhere to be seen, but the cargo is undamaged and the engine is still going. The replacement mirror had been taken out, leaving no evidence that it had ever been there. Other truck drivers have had experiences with Pete's Midnight Auto Repair, which is consistently located in various areas and consistently provides affordable, speedy repairs. Those that accept his mirror replacements end up seeing things that lie between reflection and reality, as well as potential futures that haven't yet occurred, learning that some information has an unpayable cost and that some facts are too horrible to endure. Across the highway system, the mirrors are still mounted on vehicles, giving drivers a view of parallel worlds to our own. The majority of truckers learn to disregard what they not look at the accursed reflections, to concentrate on the path ahead, and to believe only what their own eyes do. However, some people are unable to quit searching for the truth that lies under the surface of everyday reality. Pale figures cling to the outside of automobiles. The future is written in visions too terrible to ignore, and their trucks are discovered abandoned on distant highways with mirrors missing and drivers gone into whatever reality lurks on the other side of reflection. 7. The Way Station that weighs souls. After 12 years of transporting machinery throughout the Midwest, Dave Kowalski believed he knew every way station between Chicago and Denver. Scales from the Department of Transportation were only one aspect of the work. Routine halts at which authorities weighed you, looked through your logbooks, and examined your equipment before allowing you to resume driving. This is why Dave's understanding of the traffic laws was completely upended by what transpired near mile marker 247 on Interstate 80 in Iowa. Around 2 a.m., the way station came into view his headlights. In 2020, on a misty October evening, Dave managed to stay ahead of time while transporting a shipment of industrial equipment from Chicago to Colorado. Inadequate visibility, all trucks must enter, was displayed on the electronic sign in the recognizable orange letters. Dave guided his rig onto the scale platform and the downshifting. However, there was an instant issue with this way station. Dave had never seen a dot building that appeared to be decades older. Worn brick walls, little, there were bars on the windows, and a chimney that spewed black smoke into the night. Strange symbols were engraved into the concrete platform around the borders of the enormous scale, which was much larger than was required for weighing trucks. Out of the structure came a figure dressed in what appeared to be a dot uniform, but the clothes were outdated, as though they had been made in the 1950s. The tall, thin inspector had pale skin and eyes that gleamed like an animal in the floodlights of the station. Inspector was written on his name tag. Evening driver, Morrison said in a voice that echoed oddly, as though he was speaking from inside a deep well, but the letters seemed to change and blur any time Dave tried to focus on them. Please exit your car so we can assess it tonight. We must inspect more than just your cargo. With documents in hand, Dave hopped out of his taxi. However, Morrison showed no interest in his bills of lights or logbooks. Rather, the inspector circled Dave's truck at a leisurely pace, tracing the surface of the trailer with his fingers and occasionally pushing his ear against the metal, as though listening for anything within. Morrison checked a clipboard that appeared to be covered in text Dave couldn't quite read and stated, "Your cargo weight looks fine. We must measure something else, though. Please get on the platform." Morrison pointed to a narrow strip of the scale platform that had been painted white. Dave paused. No inspector had ever asked him to stand on the scales himself in his 12 years of trucking, but Morrison's pale eyes exuded a command that appeared to demand compliance. Dave then entered the assigned space. Incomprehensible figures flickered on the digital readout, not pounds or tons, but odd figures that seemed to change and evolve while Dave watched. Morrison scowled while consulting his clipboard and taking notes. Even though Dave couldn't see any graphite touching the paper, the pencil left marks. "Interesting," said Morrison softly. Morrison took Dave into the way station building, which was much larger inside than its exterior should have permitted. "You're carrying much more than your manifest indicates. We're going to need to do a detailed inspection. Sit here, please," Morrison said, pointing to a chair in front of what appeared to be a giant balance scale. The interior resembled a hybrid of an old-fashioned medical examination room and a government office, complete with filing cabinets filled with manila folders, examination tables covered in white sheets, and odd equipment that hummed and clicked. In the darkness, the traditional type, where two plates are hung from a central beam. However, the left plate contained items Dave was unable to identify in place of weights on one side, objects that changed color and appeared to absorb light instead of reflect it. Morrison started posing queries that were unrelated to trucking laws. He was curious about Dave's early years, romances, frustrations, and regrets. The items on the scale appeared to get heavier with each response, and that side of the balance sank lower, while Morrison jotted down more notes on his enigmatic clipboard. With a start, Morrison remarked, "Tell me about the accident in Milwaukee." Dave felt his blood freeze. The mishap had occurred 8 years in the past. An intentional moment, he would run a red light. Someone who happened to be in the crosswalk at the wrong time. No charges had ever been brought against Dave. Everything had been covered by the insurance. Additionally, the tragedy was formally categorized as inevitable. However, Dave was aware of the reality. He had been too exhausted and preoccupied to meet the delivery date. Dave lied. "I have no idea what you're talking about." With a smile, Morrison flashed teeth that appeared much too sharp for human teeth. "Mr. Kowalski, the scale is honest. You're bearing the burden of that man's passing, the shame of never coming clean, and the guilt of the family you wrecked. That's quite a burden for a single truck." Dave could see his reflection in the dark things on the left plate as the balancing scale tilted even more. His mirror, however, was off. He was older, more gaunt, and had hollow eyes that revealed sorrow and shame that he had spent years trying to hide. Without any of the stories he told himself about that night in Milwaukee, The picture captured him for what he truly was. Morrison persisted in questioning Dave about other instances he had made an effort to forget. The time he almost struck a school bus while driving under the influence. When his truck broke down, he left a shipment of medication behind, knowing that sick patients would be left without their prescriptions. In order to falsify his logbooks, he had accepted bribes. He had misled about the safety inspections. He had disregarded the rules in order to save time and money. The scale tilted further with each confession, and the shadowy items on the left plate appeared to become more substantial and genuine. Dave understood they weren't even objects. They were the physical manifestation of all the bad decisions he had ever made, all the instances of cowardice and selfishness he had ever experienced. "You're overweight, far too heavy to continue on the highways," Morrison explained, looking at his clipboard. "We will have to reduce your burden." Morrison took out a big folder with Dave's name from a filing cabinet, which had pictures, documents, and what appeared to be medical records from Dave's early years. But the pages also included things that shouldn't be there. Records of ideas Dave had never expressed out loud, memories he had attempted to repress, and nightmares and dreams that had come to him during the darkest hours of the night. "We provide a number of weight loss options," Morrison stated. "We can eliminate specific memories. For example, you might utterly forget about the accident. Or we can assign blame to another person, maybe a relative who has never committed a crime. Complete reorganization of the personality is the most preferred option. Your physique and trucking abilities are retained, but a cleaner, more effective model takes the place of everything else." With increasing terror, Dave recognized that this station wasn't typical. The moral weight of souls was measured and adjusted in some sort of supernatural processing center. The names of thousands of drivers who had come through this facility were in the other files in Morrison's cabinet. They are all transporting loads that are too heavy for regular roads. "What would happen if I said no?" Dave inquired. Morrison smiled more broadly, flashing those impossible too sharp teeth. "Your current load will then continue to grow heavier as you carry it. Every mile you drive, every day you live, the weight of your choices will increase until it crushes you completely. The majority of drivers would rather use our services than that substitute." Dave gazed at the balance scale, seeing his image in those shadowy items that contained all of his accumulated shame and guilt. He considered how good it would feel to have everything taken away, to drive out of here with a clear conscience, and no recollection of the suffering he'd brought to others. However, a part of him objected to the offer. He was a product of those memories, even the bad ones. The guilt and regret had made him a more careful driver, a more considerate person. Taking away his mistakes would also take away the lessons they taught him. "I'll keep my load," Dave said finally. Morrison looked genuinely surprised. "Are you certain? The weight will only increase. Every time you make another mistake, tell another lie, hurt another person, the load gets heavier. Eventually, it will destroy you. Then I'll have to be more careful about what I add to it," Dave replied. Morrison shrugged and made a final notation on his clipboard. "Very well, but remember, Mr. Kowalski, we're always here when you change your mind." The scales never close, and the weight never stops accumulating. Dave walked back to his truck, climbed into the cab, and drove away from the way station. When he checked his mirrors, the facility had vanished, leaving only empty highway behind him. But Dave could feel the difference in his truck. It was indeed heavier now, weighted down with the full knowledge of everything he'd done wrong in his life. The load never got lighter. If anything, it grew heavier over the years, as Dave became more aware of how his choices affected others. But he also became a better driver, a better person, carrying his burden with the knowledge that some weights are meant to be borne rather than transferred to others. Other truckers report encounters with similar way stations, facilities that appear on empty stretches of highway when drivers are carrying more than cargo in their trailers. Some accept Morrison's offer and drive away unburdened, but somehow diminished. Others, like Dave, choose to keep their loads and live with the consequences of their choices. The way station is still out there, appearing to drivers whose souls have grown too heavy for normal highways to support. Morrison continues his work, offering relief to those who can't bear the weight of their own actions. But the scale always balances eventually, and someone somewhere always pays the price for the loads we choose to carry through the dark hours of the night. 8. The sleeper berth that dreams alone. Marcus Williams had owned his Peterbilt 379 for 6 years when he bought the used sleeper berth from a truck salvage yard outside Memphis. The original berth had been damaged in a minor accident, and Marcus needed a replacement before his next long-haul run to Seattle. The salvage yard owner, a nervous man with twitching hands, sold him the unit for half the usual price and seemed eager to get it off his lot. The berth looked normal enough, standard size, decent condition with dark blue curtains, and a firm mattress that showed minimal wear. What the salvage yard owner didn't mention was where the berth had come from or why the previous owner had ripped it out of his truck in the middle of the night and demanded it be destroyed. Marcus had the berth installed at a truck shop in Little Rock and was back on the road within 12 hours. His first night sleeping in the new berth seemed perfectly normal. He pulled into a rest area outside Nashville, drew the curtains, and settled in for his mandatory 8-hour break. The sleep was deep and restful, the kind of solid rest that long-haul truckers rarely experienced. But when Marcus woke up, he noticed something strange. His logbook showed he'd been asleep for exactly 8 hours, but his truck's clock indicated only 3 hours had passed. Even stranger, his GPS showed he'd somehow traveled 47 miles while parked at the rest area. Marcus checked his fuel gauge and odometer. Both confirmed that his truck had been driven while he slept. At first, Marcus assumed there was a malfunction with his truck's electronics. GPS systems glitch sometimes, and clocks could be affected by electrical problems. But the next night, the same thing happened. Marcus went to sleep at a truck stop in Wyoming and woke up to find his truck had somehow moved to a different parking space facing the opposite direction from where he'd parked. Security cameras at the truck stop showed something that made Marcus's blood run cold. The footage revealed his truck starting up at 3 o'clock a.m. and driving itself around the parking lot for nearly an hour. The cab lights were on, and through the windshield, the cameras captured a figure behind the steering wheel. But Marcus had been asleep in his berth the entire time, and the figure driving his truck didn't look quite human. The shape was roughly Marcus' size and build, but its movements were wrong, too fluid, too precise, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. When the figure turned toward the camera, its face was a perfect blank, featureless, except for two dark holes where eyes should have been. Marcus tried staying awake for the next several nights, but exhaustion eventually forced him to sleep. Each time he used the berth, the same thing happened. He would fall into an unnaturally deep sleep and wake to find his truck had been driven by something that wore his appearance but wasn't him. The entity seemed to be learning, becoming more confident with each night, taking longer trips and venturing farther from wherever Marcus had parked. Other truckers began reporting strange encounters with Marcus's truck during the hours when he should have been sleeping. They described seeing his Peterbilt on highways where Marcus had no memory of driving, operated by a driver who waved but never responded to CB radio calls. Some said the figure behind the wheel looked wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to recreate Marcus' appearance from a poorly developed photograph. The entity's trips became more ambitious. Marcus would go to sleep in one state and wake to find evidence he'd driven hundreds of miles overnight. His fuel consumption increased dramatically. His tires showed unusual wear patterns, and toll road cameras captured images of his truck passing through areas Marcus had never visited. Worse, the entity seemed to be interacting with people during these nocturnal journeys. Marcus received thank you cards from strangers claiming he'd help them with roadside assistance in the middle of the night. A waitress at a diner in Oklahoma called to thank him for the enormous tip he'd left after a meal Marcus had no memory of eating. Gas station attendants recognized him from previous visits that had never happened. The entity was living a parallel life using Marcus' truck and identity, creating relationships and experiences that Marcus would never remember. It was as if something had learned to inhabit his berth while he slept, taking control of his vehicle and his appearance to explore the world during the hours when Marcus' consciousness was absent. Marcus tried sleeping in motel bed of his berth, but the entity seemed bound to the truck rather than to him personally. Hotel security cameras captured his Peterbilts, leaving parking lots in the middle of the night, driving itself with the same featureless figure behind the wheel. The entity appeared to be growing stronger, more independent, less dependent on Marcus' physical presence to animate his truck. The breakthrough came when Marcus installed a hidden camera in his cab, positioned to record the berth area while he slept. Something inexplicable was shown in the video. As Marcus fell asleep, a shadowy duplicate of himself began forming on the berth beside him. The duplicate was translucent at first, like smoke shaped into human form, but it gradually solidified until it looked exactly like Marcus in every detail. The duplicate would then climb out of the berth, start the truck, and drive away while Marcus continued sleeping. But the most horrifying part was what happened to Marcus while his duplicate was gone. The cameras showed his body becoming increasingly transparent, fading until he was barely visible against the berth's dark fabric. The entity wasn't just copying him. It was slowly replacing him, drawing substance from his sleeping form to make itself more real. Marcus realized he was being consumed by something that lived in the berth, something that fed on the dreams and life force of whoever slept there. Each night he became a little less solid, while his duplicate became more substantial. Eventually, the entity would be complete and Marcus would fade away entirely, leaving only the duplicate to live his life and drive his truck. The research Marcus conducted into the berth's history confirmed his worst fears. The previous owner, a trucker named Ray Sullivan, had mysteriously vanished 3 months before Marcus bought the berth. Ray's truck had been found idling at a rest stop, sleeper berth empty, with no sign of where the driver had gone. Security footage showed re-entering his berth for the night, but never emerging. But other footage from the same time period showed Ray's truck being driven around the country by someone who looked exactly like him. The duplicate had eventually abandoned the truck and disappeared, presumably to start a new life, using Ray's stolen identity. The salvage yard owner had been desperate to sell the berth because he suspected what had happened but couldn't prove it. Marcus tried everything to break the connection between himself and the entity. He blessed the berth with holy water, burned sage to cleanse negative energy, even had a priest perform an exorcism. Nothing worked. The entity continued to grow stronger each night, and Marcus could feel himself becoming weaker, more translucent, less connected to his own body. The final confrontation came when Marcus decided to stay awake and confront the entity as it formed. He watched in horror as his duplicate materialized on the bird, becoming solid enough to cast shadows in the dim light. When the duplicate opened its eyes, they were completely black, like looking into deep wells that reflected no light. "You can't stop this," the duplicate said in Marcus' own voice. "I've been waiting in this berth 4 years, growing stronger with each dreamer who fed me. Soon I'll acquire enough substance to exist independently, and you'll just be a recollection that disappears with the early light." Marcus tried to resist the creature, but his hands went through it like smoke. The copy laughed and stated that Marcus was already more ghost than man, to fading to touch the physical world. The thing had been stealing fragments of Marcus' essence each night, utilizing them to develop itself into a flawless replacement. Marcus' truck was located 3 weeks later at a rest stop in Montana. Engine running, berth empty, save for a faint outline on the mattress that looks somewhat human. The new owner of Marcus' identity has been sighted at truck stops around the country, living Marcus' life better than Marcus ever did, captivating other drivers with stories of adventures Marcus never had. The berth was sold again to another unsuspecting trucker. And the cycle continues. Somewhere on the highways of America, the sleeper berth that dreams alone is waiting for its next victim, ready to slowly consume another driver's essence, while they sleep, creating perfect duplicates that walk away with stolen lives, while the originals fade into nothing more than impressions on a mattress, where dreams go to die and nightmares are born. 9. The exit that only appears at 3:33 a.m. Leonard Hayes had been driving the same way from Tucson to El Paso for 9 years, transporting auto parts through the desert on Interstate 10. He knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every exit between the two cities. That's why when exit 66B emerged in his headlights at exactly 3:33 a.m. during a moonless night in August 2021, Leonard felt something was profoundly wrong with the planet. The exit wasn't on any map. Leonard had studied highway atlases, GPS systems, and dock construction reports for years, and there had never been an exit 66B on this stretch of I-10. The standard exits were numbered 65, 67, and 69. There was number 66 of any kind, let alone a 66B, but there it was, fully designated with normal green highway signage, complete with shiny text that caught his headlights like a beacon in the darkness. Pishin Township, services available, was written in the exit sign's recognizable white letters on green backdrop, which were used to identify all interstate off-ramps in the United States. However, Leonard was unaware about Pishin Township. Additionally, his chart showed that, for 50 meters in all directions, this area of desert was made up entirely of barren ground. Leonard's logbook stated he was making good time, and his fuel gauge showed he had enough diesel to get to El Paso. It made little sense to take an unmarked exit that led to a non-existent town. However, there was something about the sign that made him slow down, turn right, and steer his 18-wheeler down the off-ramp into whatever was beyond the familiar glow of the interstate. Longer than necessary, the exit ramp descended slowly into a darkness that appeared thicker than usual at night. It seemed as though the blackness itself was absorbing the light from Leonard's headlights, which only peaked a few yards ahead. It also felt odd on the pavement beneath his wheels. It seemed older and rougher, as though it had been constructed decades before the current interstate system. Leonard discovered a stop sign at the bottom of the ramp that appeared to have been hand-painted rather than manufactured. It was followed by a two-lane road that vanished into a complete, seemingly solid blackness, apart from a weathered wooden sign that read Pishin Township, population 0 in faded white paint. There were no building lights, no street lights, and no other indications of civilization. At that point, Leonard ought to have turned around, ought to have re-entered the interstate, and acted as though he had never noticed the impossibly difficult exit. However, the mystery of this hidden town drew him in, a fishing line hooked in his brain, and truck drivers are naturally curious. He put the car in first gear and rolled into the night. The paved road through Pishin Township had cracks, and weeds were growing in almost intentional patterns through the asphalt. Buildings on both sides of the street were visible through Leonard's headlights, a gas station, stores, homes, and even what appeared to be a tiny church with a crooked steeple. However, all of the buildings had been deserted, dark, and dark for so long that nature had started to take them back. Despite the obvious abandonment, everything appeared so well preserved that it made Leonard's skin crawl. There were no indications of structural collapse, fire damage, or vandalism on the buildings, despite the eerie silence that suggested no one had lived here for years. The paint looked new, the windows were intact, and the doors hung straight on their hinges. Leonard got out of his cab and parked his truck in front of what looked like a general store. There was complete silence, no insects, no wind, and no distant interstate traffic noises. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound properly. The general store's front door was unlocked. Inside, Leonard found shelves stocked with merchandise that looked normal at first glance, but wrong upon closer inspection. Canned goods bore familiar brand names, with slight variations. Campbell's soap instead of soup, Coca-Cola instead of Coca-Cola. Newspapers on a rack were dated from various years, but all showed the same headline: Residents report strange dreams. Investigation continues. Behind the counter, Leonard found a guest register book that made his blood run cold. The pages were filled with names, dates, and signatures of people who had apparently visited Petition Township over the past several decades, but the dates were impossible. Some entries were from the future, others from years before the town could have existed, and many were written in handwriting that seemed to shift and change as Leonard watched. Leonard Hayes had been driving the same road from Tucson to El Paso for 9 years, hauling auto parts through the desert on Interstate 10. He knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every exit between the two cities. That's why when exit 66B emerged in his headlights at exactly 3:33 a.m. during a moonless night in August 2021, Leonard felt something was profoundly wrong with the planet. The exit wasn't on any map. Leonard had studied highway atlases, GPS systems, and dock construction reports for years, and there had never been an exit 66B on this stretch of I-10. The standard exits were numbered 65, 67, and 69. There was number 66 of any kind, let alone a 66B. But there it was, clearly marked with standard green highway signage, complete with reflective lettering that caught his headlights like a beacon in the darkness. The exit sign read, Petition Township, services available in the familiar white letters on green background that marked every interstate or ramp across America. But Leonard had never heard of Petition Township, and according to his maps, this section of desert contained nothing but empty land for 50 miles in every direction. Leonard's logbook stated he was making good time, and his fuel gauge showed he had enough diesel to get to El Paso. It made little sense to take an unmarked exit that led to a non-existent town. However, there was something about the sign that made him slow down, turn right, and steer his 18-wheeler down the off-ramp into whatever was beyond the familiar glow of the interstate. Longer than necessary, the exit ramp descended slowly into a darkness that appeared thicker than usual at night. It seemed as though the blackness itself was absorbing the light from Leonard's headlights, which only peaked a few yards ahead. It also felt odd on the pavement beneath his wheels. It seemed older and rougher, as though it had been constructed decades before the current interstate system. Leonard discovered a stop sign at the bottom of the ramp that appeared to have been hand-painted rather than manufactured. Beyond it stretched a 2-lane road that disappeared into blackness, so complete it seemed solid. No street lights, no building lights, no signs of civilization except for a weathered wooden sign that read Petition Township, population 0, in faded white paint. Leonard should have turned around then, should have climbed back onto the interstate, and pretended he'd never seen the impossible exit. However, the mystery of this hidden town drew him in, a fishing line hooked in his brain, and truck drivers are naturally curious. He put the car in first gear and rolled into the night. The paved road through Petition Township had cracks, and weeds were growing in almost intentional patterns through the asphalt. Buildings on both sides of the street were visible through Leonard's headlights, a gas station, stores, homes, and even what appeared to be a tiny church with a crooked steeple. However, all of the buildings had been deserted, dark for so long that nature had started to take them back. Despite the obvious abandonment, everything appeared so well preserved that it made Leonard's skin crawl. There were no indications of structural collapse, fire damage, or vandalism on the buildings. Despite the eerie silence that suggested no one had lived here for years, the paint looked new, the windows were intact, and the doors hung straight on their hinges. Leonard parked his truck in front of what appeared to be a general store and climbed down from his cab. There was complete silence. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic sounds from the interstate. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound properly. The general store's front door was unlocked. Inside, Leonard found shelves stocked with merchandise that looked normal at first glance, but wrong upon closer inspection. Canned goods bore familiar brand names with slight variations. Campbell's soap instead of soup, Coca-Cola instead of Coca-Cola. Newspapers on a rack were dated from various years, but all showed the same headline: Residents report strange dreams. Investigation continues. Behind the counter, Leonard found a guest register book that made his blood run cold. The pages were filled with names, dates, and signatures of people who had apparently visited Petition Township over the past several decades. But the dates were impossible. Some entries were from the future, others from years before the town could have existed, and many were written in handwriting that seemed to shift and change as Leonard watched. The interstate stalker Eddie Castellanos had hauled every type of freight imaginable during his 16 years on the road, but nothing had prepared him for the shipment he picked up from a funeral home in Savannah, Georgia on a humid September night in 2022. The manifest listed it as mortuary equipment bound for a cemetery in New Orleans, and the funeral director, who met Eddie at the loading dock, was oddly insistent that the delivery be made before dawn. The cargo consisted of 6 ornate wooden caskets, each one crafted from dark mahogany with brass fittings that gleamed under the loading dock's fluorescent lights. They were beautiful pieces of workmanship, the kind of expensive coffins that wealthy families ordered for their deceased relatives. What struck Eddie as odd was how heavy they were. Each casket required a forklift to load, despite the funeral director's assurance that they were empty. Premium construction, the funeral director explained when Eddie questioned the weight. Solid wood, lead-lined for preservation. The families in New Orleans appreciate quality craftsmanship, but his hands shook as he signed the paperwork, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to emerge from the funeral home's darkened interior. Eddie secured the caskets in his trailer with extra straps and chains, noting that they seemed to settle into the trailer bed with unusual finality, as if they belonged there. The funeral director handed him a sealed envelope containing specific delivery instructions and emphasized that the caskets must not be opened under any circumstances during transport. The first hour of the drive proceeded normally as Eddie navigated through Savannah's suburban sprawl toward Interstate 16, but as he reached the open highway and settled into cruising speed, he began to notice his truck was laboring more than it should. His engine worked harder to maintain speed, and hills that should have been easy climbs became significant challenges. Eddie pulled into a weigh station outside of Moan to check his load. The scale reading made his blood run cold. His truck weighed approximately 120,000 pounds, greatly above the permitted limit of 80,000 pounds. But according to his manifest, the 6 caskets should have added just roughly 3,000 kilograms to his overall weight. Somehow, his luggage had become 40,000 kilograms heavier during the first 100 meters of the journey. The weigh station inspector, a grizzled veteran named Chuck, strolled around Eddie's trailer with a bewildered frown. "Your axle weights are off the charts," Chuck said, consulting his clipboard. "But I can't see how 6 empty coffins could weigh this much." "You sure there's nothing else in that trailer?" Eddie assured Chuck that he was carrying only the caskets listed on his manifest, but even as he spoke, he could feel his truck sinking slightly, as if the cargo was continuing to gain weight while they talked. Chuck scribbled notes on his citation pad, but seemed reluctant to write an actual ticket for something he couldn't justify. Back on the highway, Eddie's truck struggled to reach even 40 miles per hour on level ground. Other vehicles honked angrily as they passed his crawling rig, and Eddie had to use his hazard lights to warn faster traffic of his presence. His gasoline consumption had doubled, and the engine temperature indicator crawled inexorably toward the red zone. Around midnight, as Eddie approached the Georgia-Alabama border, he began hearing sounds from his trailer. At first, there was just creaking and settling noises that could be explained by the considerable weight moving during turns and stops. But eventually, the sounds got more rhythmic, more intentional, like someone hammering on wood from the inside. The knocking developed a pattern: 3 slow taps, pause, 3 more taps, pause. It seemed to emanate from all 6 caskets simultaneously, creating an uncanny beat that resonated through the trailer walls into Eddie's cab. When he tried cranking up his radio to drown out the sound, the tapping grew louder, more relentless, as if whatever was inside the caskets was demanding his attention. Eddie stopped into a 24-hour truck stop outside Montgomery and strolled back to inspect his trailer. The caskets looked just as they were loaded. Beautiful, costly, and properly secured. But when Eddie placed his palm on the nearest coffin, he could feel tremors through the wood, like if something within was moving around. The brass fittings were warm to the touch, despite the cool night air. A fellow trucker called Sam wandered over, while Eddie was scrutinizing his goods. "Heard you approaching from a mile away," Sam responded. "Sounds like you got some unhappy passengers back there." When Eddie talked about the weight difficulties and the weird sounds, Sam's countenance went serious. "I've heard stories about shipments like this," Sam remarked quietly. "Coffins that get heavier the farther you pull them. Cargo that makes noise when it should be silent. Word is some funeral homes don't always wait for people to be completely dead before they box them up. Sometimes folks get buried alive and their spirits can't rest until they're properly put to ground." Eddie dismissed Sam's supernatural explanation, but he couldn't ignore the evidence of his own senses. His truck was now so heavy, it could barely climb the slightest incline, and the knocking from the trailer had evolved into what sounded like scratching, dozens of fingernails clawing at wood from the inside. As Eddie struggled across Alabama, the temperature inside his cab began dropping, despite his heater running full blast. Ice crystals formed on his windows, and his breath came out in visible puffs. The scratching sounds grew more frantic, accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices, calling for help in languages Eddie couldn't understand. The worst part was the smell that began seeping into his cab. By the time Eddie reached the Mississippi border, his truck weighed over 200,000 pounds, according to a portable scales rest area, and the trailer axles were groaning under the impossible load. It wasn't the antiseptic smell of embalming fluid, but the sweet, sickening scent of decay mixed with something else, something that reminded Eddie of wet earth and old graveyards, and the smell got stronger with each mile until Eddie had to breathe through his mouth to avoid gagging. There were indications of dangerous stress on the tires. The knocking and scratching from the caskets had grown loud enough for other truckers at the rest area to hear from 50 yards away. Eddie tried the cemetery in New Orleans, but no one answered, even at this late hour, and the sealed envelope's delivery instructions led to an address that his GPS said did not exist. As Eddie got closer to Louisiana, he could hear voices from the trailer, describing being buried alive, accusing the funeral home that had shipped them, and describing premature burial, waking up in the dark and discovering they had been declared dead while still conscious, and clawing at coffin lids until their fingers bled. Eddie was trapped, hauling a load that was literally crushing his truck, while carrying cargo that seemed determined to claw its way out of confinement. As Eddie's truck finally broke down on the outskirts of the cemetery, he realized with increasing horror that he was not carrying empty caskets, but rather the bodies of people who had been buried alive, their spirits trapped in their coffins and growing stronger with each mile away from the place where they'd been wrongfully interred. The weight increase wasn't physical, it was spiritual, the accumulated anguish and rage of the improperly buried dead. As Eddie crawled out of the wreckage, he heard the caskets behind him split open, releasing decades of accumulated suffering into the Louisiana night. The entire rig collapsed under the impossible weight of his cargo. The engine seized, the trailer axles snapped, and 6 figures emerged from the destroyed trailer, not zombies or ghosts, but something far more horrible. They were the spiritual. They moved purposefully toward the lights of New Orleans, seeking the funeral home directors and corrupt officials who had profited from their premature burial. Eddie survived the encounter, but he never drove a truck again, spending weeks in psychiatric care, babbling about caskets that contained the concentrated fury of the improperly dead and cargo that grew heavier with every mile. They were the essence of people who had died in agony, who had been buried before their time, and whose rage had fermented in wooden boxes until it became something that could affect the physical world. The insurance inquiry determined that Eddie had damaged his own truck on purpose for experiencing a mental breakdown. However, nobody might account for the scores of witnesses who reported hearing the noises or the unusual weight measurements. The 6 figures never came out of his trailer again. However, funeral homes began to encounter unexplained issues, equipment malfunctions, and mysterious incidents, and staff members who departed after alleging interactions with irate ghosts, calling for justice for those who were buried too soon. A few loads are also heavy for any truck to transport, particularly when the weight is derived from the cumulative anguish of spirits who passed over too soon and won't stop until their tales are spoken. Hello, hello.